Hey guys, today we're going to learn about the cell membrane. So we're going to start with what the cell membrane is made up of. And it is made up of these little things that you see on the screen. They are called phospholipids. So the top of this is called a hydrophilic head. It's a phosphate, and it's called hydrophilic because it loves water. Now, if you remember, water is polar, so the reason that this loves water is because it's polar as well. The tails, however, are hydrophobic. So you can think, if you have a phobia, you're afraid of something, so these are water-fearing. They do not like water, and that is because these are nonpolar. They're lipids, and they are nonpolar. So we have our phospholipid. And then the cell membrane is made up of two of those phospholipids. So because of that, it is called the phospholipid bilayer, because bi means two. So it's called the phospholipid bilayer. And if you think about it, then these hydrophilic heads are in contact with water on the inside and outside of the cell. And the tails get to hide from water here on the inside of the cell membrane. Now, these things that are stuck in the cell membrane, those are called membrane proteins. And we'll talk about what those can be used for. Membrane proteins. Now, there's a lot of things that need to get across the cell membrane, either to get into the cell or get out of the cell. So one way that this can happen is called diffusion. Now, diffusion is a type of passive transport because it doesn't use any energy. And what it is it's when things move from an area of higher concentration like this to an area of low concentration like out here. So basically it's like something spreading out, okay? If someone farts in a room, all that smell of their fart is concentrated around them, and it spreads out around the room to areas of lower concentration. Now, another type of diffusion is called facilitated diffusion. So let's break this definition down. Passive transport. Passive means that this doesn't require any energy. Passive transport of solutes, remember those are things that are dissolved, solutes, so maybe these are some nutrients that are going into the cell, some waste that are coming out of the cell, through membrane proteins. So remember when we labeled those membrane proteins, some of those let little particles diffuse through them. So these would be things that are too big or can't get through the membrane through simple diffusion, so they have to go through these membrane proteins. Now, osmosis, that is a specific type of diffusion. And this is when water diffuses across, we say, a selectively permeable cell membrane. And so what that selectively permeable means is that the cell membrane, it only lets certain things through. And water is one of those things that can cross the cell membrane on its own. So when water diffuses across the cell membrane, that's called osmosis. Now, osmosis can lead to a couple different situations because water can move in and out of the cell. If the water concentration is greater in the cell than outside of the cell, we have what's called a hypertonic solution. And what that means is water is going to move out of the cell. So for example, if you have a slug and you put salt on that, water is going to move out of the slug and it's going to shrivel up and it's going to die. That's an example of a hypertonic solution. Isotonic, that's when the water concentration is equal inside the cell and outside the cell. So water is moving in and out at an equal rate and the cell keeps its shape. So for example, our blood has a similar concentration of water as cells. So then water is moving in and out of the cells at the same rate. Hypotonic solution is when water concentration is greater outside the cell. So water moves into the cell. So an example of this could be the roots of plants. Because the water concentration is greater out in the soil, water is going to move into the cells, and that's good for plants. Now we talked about passive transport, which doesn't require energy, but active transport uses energy, called ATP, we'll talk about that, to move substances in or out of the cell. So let's look at some examples of that. So there are three main ways that active transport can happen, okay? One way is through protein pumps. So, there we go. Protein pumps. And so these are things that use those membrane proteins to get across the cell membrane, but it requires energy, ATP, okay? So whatever is going through the cell membrane would go into this protein, then it would use energy to change shape and release it on the other side of the cell membrane. Another thing that can happen to get particles into the cell, and this would usually be larger things, is called endocytosis. Endo because it's going in. And so this is where the cell membrane will like fold in on itself with this particle inside of it and form a vesicle. So this area of the cell membrane will pinch off and go into the cell. And that is endocytosis. And then that same thing can happen to get things out of the cell. That's called exocytosis. So we'll look at some examples of this later this week. But exocytosis, this vesicle, fuses with the cell membrane and then releases that. Now I talked about how active transport requires energy, and that energy is called ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate, because there's these three phosphates here. So that is what the cell uses for energy, and how it gets energy from that is actually by breaking this last bond between these phosphates. This is a high energy bond, so when that bond breaks, it releases energy. So bond breaks and releases energy. So that's how the cell can actually use the energy that's in ATP.